May. A pale, wind-washed morning along the Outer Banks, the kind of morning that usually carried nothing more threatening than gull calls and the slow churn of the Atlantic. But this year, the waves rolled in differently. They carried oil streaks, pieces of charred planking, and in one case, the burned life jacket of a tanker crewman who never reached shore. The East Coast was under a kind of pressure it had not known in generations. German U-boats had moved close, too close, slipping along the curves of the American shoreline like knives testing the grain of wood. Merchant ships had begun to burn at night, burning so close to land that residents reported they could read by the flames. And in those thin hours before sunrise, the U.S. Coast Guard stationed along North Carolina's rough barrier coastline moved with a heavy quietness. Patrols were doubled. Messages were shorter. Every set of footsteps on the sand carried the weight of someone who understood that the war had come directly to America's own border. On that morning, a single figure moved faster than the rest, a 12-year-old boy, thin, brown-haired, with the wiry speed of someone used to running barefoot over dunes. He reached the weather-beaten wooden station house before most of the enlisted crew. No one called out to stop him. By now, he had become part of the daily rhythm. The Coast Guardsmen called him their mascot, but the truth was sharper. He had become an extra set of eyes during a time when every pair mattered. He was too young to enlist, too young to stand an official watch, and too young to be sent into real danger. But the coastline did not respect the rules. Danger came whether the country was ready or not. He slipped inside the station, grabbed the salt-fogged binoculars he was allowed to use, and climbed the narrow watchtower ladder. It creaked beneath his weight. It always creaked, but he knew how to move in a way that kept the noise low. The boy stepped into the small lookout room just as the sky broke into thin gold at the horizon. Below him stretched a coastline wounded by war yet eerily beautiful. Sand dunes rolled like pale hills, sea oats bent in the wind, and the long Atlantic swell crawled toward shore with a rhythm older than any nation. Nothing on the surface suggested an enemy. Nothing suggested movement. And yet, the silence carried a tension that was impossible to ignore. The Coast Guard had learned a painful lesson since the winter. U-boats used dawn and dusk like cloaks. Periscopes were easier to conceal in the shifting light. Torpedo wakes vanished quickly. Smoke columns at night were too easy to spot from offshore. This hour, the hour the boy now watched, was the hour that often revealed the first hints of danger. He steadied the binoculars against the wooden frame, breathing slow, scanning left to right in disciplined sweeps he had learned by watching the enlisted men. He knew the patterns, the shimmer of a periscope at long distance, the unnatural straightness of an oil slick, the wake that didn't match the pulse of the waves. He had seen enough in the past months to understand what mattered. The Coast Guardsmen never talked about it directly, but the boy had pieced it together. Merchant ships were being sunk so frequently that local fishermen had started refusing night runs. Some smaller coastal communities had held quiet emergency meetings. And most revealing of all, the Coast Guard had begun assigning two-man night patrols on horseback for the dunes, looking for any sign of enemy landings or sabotage. A seabird drifted low over the water, then another. The boy tracked them out of habit. The horizon remained clean. For a moment, it seemed like the morning would stay peaceful. That was when the change happened. A faint glimmer, so small that it existed only between two rising waves, caught his eye. It wasn't the bright flash of sunlight on water. It was narrower, steadier, and unmistakably metallic. The boy lowered the binoculars a fraction, exhaled, and brought them up again. This time he searched more slowly, slicing the horizon into smaller segments. There, a brief needle-like reflection far beyond the surf line. He didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply locked onto it, recognizing instantly what the Coast Guard men had drilled into him through their own urgency. Periscopes rarely stayed exposed for more than a few seconds. The Germans were too careful, too experienced, too aware of how exposed they were so close to the beach. The boy steadied himself. His heartbeat wasn't fear. It was focus. He knew that if he confirmed this, even as a child volunteer, he might be giving the station some of the most important seconds of the entire day. Below him, The station door opened. Boots struck the sand. The full crew was beginning their morning cycle. The reflection flickered again. Not a wave. Not a bird. Not debris. Something intentional. Something watching the coast. Something hunting. The boy took one last breath, committed the coordinates to memory, and moved for the tower ladder without hesitation. He had just spotted what grown men spent their careers searching for, and he was only 12. The coastline had not always demanded this kind of vigilance. A year earlier, the beaches here belonged to fishermen, children, and the slow-moving rhythm of a coastal life that believed the world's largest war was separated from them by an entire ocean. But the ocean was not a barrier. It was a door, and the Germans knew exactly how to use it. When the first tankers were torpedoed within sight of the North Carolina dunes, most Americans had not yet accepted that the East Coast itself could become part of a battlefield. Ships burned against the night sky like floating bonfires. Their flames lit the clouds, the beaches, and even the bedroom walls of families living miles inland. Newspapers had tried to soften the reports, describing the losses as isolated. But the Coast Guard knew the truth. U-boats had discovered something critically vulnerable, a coastline rich in shipping traffic, but poor in coordinated defense. This was the world the boy grew up in. He learned the war not from textbooks, but from the things washing ashore: twisted steel, oil-soaked birds, charred scraps of lifeboats. His mother had tried to keep him away from the beaches on the worst mornings, but curiosity overcame warnings. He saw the black oil stains before the adults could scrub them from the sand. He recognized the smell of burned diesel before he recognized the meaning of the news broadcasts. Each wreck made the war feel closer, until the boy understood something children were not meant to understand, that there were enemies just beyond the horizon, watching the same sunrise he did. The Coast Guard station had always been part of his world. He knew the men there long before they knew him by name. He helped carry water buckets during hot days. He fetched tools. He ran messages to the next station down the beach. To the enlisted men he was harmless at first, a curious child with sand permanently stuck to his ankles. But war compresses people together. It erases lines that would normally stand firm. The boy became useful, not officially, not in any documented way, but the station chief, an older man with deep creases at the corners of his eyes, began letting the boy help with small, harmless tasks. The boy swept sand from the deck. He passed binoculars up the watchtower ladder. He coiled signal rope with careful precision. He listened. More importantly, he understood. He learned the shapes of vessels from identification flashcards the Coast Guardsmen reviewed during slow hours. He memorized the color of smoke from burning crude oil versus gasoline. He learned how U-boats used thermal layers to hide beneath warmer surface water. He absorbed the logic of the patrols, why they rode horses on certain nights, why they searched the dunes at others, and why the men never let silence settle without someone scanning the sea. The station's changes reflected the enormous adjustments the entire American coast was undergoing. Ships now ran in convoy when possible. Navigation lights were extinguished at night. Civilian blackout drills happened weekly. Every lighthouse from Maine to Florida received strict instructions about when to dim their beacons. Even fishermen began carrying signal flares, worried that a wrong shadow on the surface might draw a torpedo intended for someone else. By early spring, the boy's life and the station's life had intertwined completely. He often arrived before sunrise to watch the shift change. He learned the rhythm of the men's movements, the way they scanned the water, the quiet mutters they exchanged about weather and visibility, the urgency hidden beneath every routine. The Coast Guard had no formal category for a boy like him, but war creates its own roles. He became the extra set of eyes. No one officially requested, but everyone noticed. And when the station was stretched thin, patrols extended, crew shortages growing, his presence in the tower became more than harmless curiosity. It became an advantage. One morning, a lieutenant saw the boy perched in the watchtower, his small silhouette framed against the rising sun. Instead of ordering him down, the officer simply nodded and said nothing. He recognized the truth. The boy had learned the same scanning discipline the coastal watch volunteers were being trained to use up and down the East Coast. If anything, he was faster. The U-boat threat continued sharpening. The Germans were bold, surfacing at night to charge batteries, radio coordinates, or shadow shipping lanes. They used American coastal lighting against the nation, watching silhouetted tankers pass like targets crossing a firing line. This was the world the boy stepped into every dawn. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He never thought of himself as anything other than someone who understood the danger because he had lived inside it. But on that day, the morning he saw the glint above the waves, he sensed that the pattern had changed. Something was closer. Something was watching. When he reached the bottom of the tower ladder that morning, breath steady, boots of the enlisted crew thudded around him. They barely noticed him at first, but the boy's expression, the fixed seriousness of it, pulled their attention. He didn't need to speak. They understood before he opened his mouth. Something was out there, and this time the boy had seen it first. The wind stiffened as the boy reached the bottom of the tower and pointed toward the horizon. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Something in the urgency of his movements made the nearest petty officer stop mid-stride. Within seconds, the quiet rhythm of the station shifted. Men who had been checking fuel cans or sealing logbooks abandoned their tasks and stepped outside. The petty officer followed the boy's gaze. Nothing looked unusual at first, just the long Atlantic swell rolling in with its usual weight. Even experienced lookouts could miss something if they tried too hard to force meaning from water and light. But the boy's certainty carried weight. He had never given a false alarm. The officer went for his binoculars. A few seconds later, another Coast Guardsman joined him. Then another. One by one, the station's men formed a silent line facing the sea. The waves rose, dipped, shimmered. For long moments there was nothing, only the neutral calm of the morning. Then a thin distortion appeared between the swells. Not a reflection this time, a shape. A line too straight, too deliberate, too clean to be part of the natural sea. A periscope cuts the water differently from anything else. It leaves almost no wake, but it pushes the surface in a way the trained eye can sense, a faint unnatural crease in the moving skin of the ocean. The petty officer exhaled sharply through his nose. He saw it too. The Coast Guard reacted instantly. There was no alarm bell to ring. They needed speed, not noise. The officer sprinted back to the station, radioing the district watch post. The message was crisp, direct, possible U-boat sighting. Range uncertain. Coordinates approximate. Request confirmation and air sweep. The boy remained frozen in place, watching the water as the men ran around him. Horses were saddled for dune patrol. The station's small rescue boat crew assembled, though they would not launch, not against a submarine. The danger was in the information, not confrontation. A junior seaman jogged past, paused, and glanced down at the boy with a quick nod. A wordless acknowledgement that he had triggered something much larger than himself. Up in the tower again, two experienced lookouts returned to verify the sighting. The boy followed them, instinctively climbing the ladder with the same speed he always had, stopping just inside the hatch as the men swept the water with binoculars. The periscope had vanished, just as they expected. U-boat commanders along the American coast had mastered the art of exposure, show nothing longer than a few seconds. A full minute on the surface meant death. The Germans' new aircraft could be overhead in less than 10 minutes. They stayed alive by staying hidden. But the disappearance didn't reassure anyone. It confirmed the danger. The lookout chief adjusted the lens, scanning slowly, methodically, slicing the horizon into segments like lines on a map. Then he caught something. A faint disturbance farther down the coast, a distortion in the water, barely perceptible through morning haze. It wasn't the periscope. It was the wake left behind, a long pale stroke that contradicted the rhythm of the waves. That was enough. The station chief entered the tower, boots shaking the floorboards. He looked through the glass for only a moment before stepping back. "It's moving south," he murmured. Not to the boy, not to the lookouts, but to himself. South meant danger for the merchant shipping lane rounding Cape Lookout. South meant fresh victims. South meant the U-boat was positioning itself to intercept tankers still too close to shore. Men descended the tower immediately to relay the adjusted coordinates. The district radio began transmitting fresh warnings, converting the boys' few seconds of observation into a chain reaction stretching across multiple stations. Within minutes, aircraft were being dispatched from a coastal airfield, small patrol bombers armed with depth charges, often piloted by crews who had learned anti-submarine warfare on the job. The boy stayed in the tower. He watched the place where the periscope had been. He watched the shifting water. He watched the long stretch of Atlantic that had swallowed merchant ships whole. In the quiet, the tower hummed with the tension of every man in the station relying on what he had seen. Minutes passed. Then the unmistakable throb of radial engines grew from the north. 2 patrol aircraft moved into view, flying low, hugging the coastline. They banked in a slow arc, changing altitude, reading the sea like an enormous map. The boy watched their shadows pulse across the water. The aircraft moved outward, toward deeper water, maintaining a search grid. The boy pressed a hand against the tower frame, bracing himself as the plane swept closer to the sighting area. That was when one of the aircraft suddenly banked hard, fast enough that sunlight flashed across its wing. They had seen something. The plane descended lower. It circled. It tightened its turn. The coastline held its breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a trail of white water burst upward. As a depth charge hit the sea, the ocean roared, lifting a column of spray high into the air. The boy didn't cheer. He didn't move. He simply watched, hands gripping the windowsill, knowing he had been the first to notice the glimmer that began all of this. A child had given the Coast Guard the seconds they needed, and on this coast, seconds could be the difference between a safe convoy and another night of burning ships. The explosion rolled across the water like a muted thunderclap, its echo flattening against the dunes before dissolving into the morning air. Spray rained back down in a widening circle, ripples rolling outward across the surface in long, trembling rings. Then everything grew still again, unnaturally still, as if the ocean itself were waiting to see whether the strike had found its mark. Down the shoreline, the Coast Guard station had emptied. Every man who could spare a moment stood outside, watching the aircraft arc across the sky in wide, deliberate circles. The boy stayed in the tower, frozen in place, his shoulders braced against the wooden frame. He knew enough now to understand that a single depth charge rarely finished a submarine, but it broke the rhythm. It forced the enemy to change position. It disrupted calculations. The patrol bomber circled lower, almost skimming the wavetops, the crew searching for signs of turbulence below the surface. The second aircraft widened the pattern, flying parallel to the first strike area. These were the moments that decided whether a U-boat escaped or died. A faint rising turbulence appeared, a patch of sea where bubbles drifted upward in a slow, shimmering curtain. The lookout chief reached the tower hatch below the boy and exhaled sharply. "Aircrew found the slick," he muttered. It was the confirmation everyone needed. Not a kill. Those were rare and difficult to confirm, but proof the U-boat had been forced down and damaged. A predator interrupted mid-hunt, and that interruption was often enough to save nearby ships. On the tower's upper platform, the boy didn't shift his stance. His eyes remained fixed on the widening turbulence, following it as if trying to see through the surface. The aircraft broke away, beginning a search sweep farther south, to be certain no second submarine shadowed the first. A tactic the Germans sometimes used to draw attention away from a more dangerous partner, lurking close behind. The station's radios crackled with updates. Warnings were issued to all coastal shipping. Convoys adjusted their timing. Offshore patrol boats altered their search lanes. All of it traced back to a moment only the boy had witnessed. A small glint on the horizon that had lasted less than a heartbeat. An enlisted seaman climbed the tower and rested his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Not in a congratulatory way, but in recognition. The gesture was brief, almost formal. Then the man descended to join the others, leaving the boy alone with the thinning morning air. Slowly, the tension loosened. The aircraft banked north again, heading back toward their airfield. One of them dipped its wings as it passed the tower. A small salute, a quiet acknowledgement from the sky. Whether the pilot meant it for the station, or for the unknown observer who had helped trigger the sortie, no one could say, but the boy saw it. He raised one hand in return, then let it fall to the windowsill as the aircraft disappeared into the haze. The ocean regained its normal rhythm. The swells rose and fell with steady indifference. The turbulence faded. For the first time since sunrise, the coastline felt like itself again. Down below, the station resumed its working pace. Horses were unsaddled. Radios switched to routine reports. The petty officer scribbled fresh notes into the day's log. Nothing in the official record would mention the boy by name. Nothing would say that a child had spotted the periscope first. The war machine didn't leave space for details that didn't fit its structure. But the men at that station would remember. In the coming weeks, whenever the boy climbed the tower, they gave him a little more room, a little more trust. Not openly. Regulations didn't allow such things. But quietly, in the unspoken ways that define wartime camaraderie, he received sharper binoculars to use. He was shown how to read the pattern of a depth charge spread. He learned why some turbulence meant a submarine was diving deeper, while other turbulence meant a vessel was struggling to rise. The Germans did not give up their coastal campaign easily. More ships were hit, more survivors washed ashore. But every time the boy climbed the lookout ladder, he did it knowing that his vigilance could give the Americans even the smallest edge. A few seconds, a slight warning, the hint of a wake that didn't belong. Seconds mattered. They mattered to tankers rounding the capes. They mattered to convoys navigating the narrow safety of blackout conditions. They mattered to the Coast Guardsmen, who faced an enemy without seeing his face. And on one morning, a single morning when the Atlantic seemed to stare back, a 12-year-old had given those seconds when no one else could. His name never entered the official war summaries. No medal marked his contribution, but among the men stationed on that wind-swept shoreline, the story circulated quietly. A child who saw what others missed. A boy who read the ocean before it could strike. A Coast Guard mascot who helped turn danger into warning. History rarely preserves such small acts with the weight they deserve. But on that coast, in that season when the war pressed against American sand, the truth endured, carved not into monuments, but into memory. The boy had stood where the land met the sea, and for a few decisive moments, he had watched the water with the eyes of someone who understood exactly what was at stake, and because of that, ships lived to see another dawn.